Hello and welcome to Pharma Talks. If you've been following the obesity weight loss medication space, you'll know that essentially it's been a two-horse race over the last little while between Lilly and Novo Nordisk. In this episode, we'll take a look at one of the newer entrants to the weight loss medication market, specifically the oral tablet form, focusing in on a new medication released by Lilly. Then we'll take a look at how that stacks up to the competition, the current standard of care in terms of obesity weight loss tablets, and we'll see if we can draw some conclusions from that on who we think is in the right position to take over the obesity weight loss market in the oral segment. If you enjoy this content, please be sure to hit like and subscribe, and I will do my best to continue to post additional videos. Thank you so much for your time, and now let's get into it. On the 1st of April 2026, the FDA approved a new medication called Foundayo for use in combination with a reduced calorie diet and increased physical activity to reduce excess body weight and maintain weight reduction long-term in adults with obesity or adults with overweight in the presence of at least one weight-related comorbid condition. Lilly was quick to celebrate this news and announced that the FDA approved Foundayo, or orforglipron, which is the medical name for it, the only GLP-1 pill for weight loss that can be taken any time of day without food or water restrictions. Now, it's interesting that they emphasize the no food or water restriction and how that can give greater flexibility in how they approach their treatment. This is clearly intended to differentiate Foundayo, or orforglipron, from the current standard of care medication for oral weight loss, which is semaglutide, because oral semaglutide, unlike orforglipron, does have some restrictions around whether or not you take it with food or water. If you take a look at the prescribing information for Wegovy, which is the semaglutide tablet by Novo Nordisk, it says that you should take one Wegovy tablet by mouth on an empty stomach in the morning with water, no more than 4 ounces, and do not take Wegovy tablets with any other liquids besides water. It also says after 30 minutes you can eat, drink, or take other oral medications. So there are some limitations around the use of semaglutide as the Wegovy tablet. However, I don't necessarily think that that would be very limiting for too many people. But clearly this is a point of emphasis for Lilly in their attempt to differentiate their drug. Now, the question is, why would they focus on the administration and not the efficacy? And I think the reason that is because you're getting more efficacy with the semaglutide tablet than with the orforglipron tablet. Now, I should add a disclaimer here that this is not based on head-to-head clinical trials. So we have to take this with a grain of salt, but we'll take a closer look at the data and sort this out shortly. So what are the Wegovy tablets? Well, Wegovy is semaglutide, and it's indicated in combination with a reduced calorie diet and increased physical activity to reduce excess body weight and maintain weight reduction long-term in adults with obesity or in adults with overweight in the presence of at least one weight-related comorbid condition. So this is the same indication as the orforglipron tablets by Lilly. The difference is that Wegovy also has another indication, which is to reduce the risk of major adverse cardiovascular events, cardiovascular death, non-fatal myocardial infarction, or non-fatal stroke in adults with established cardiovascular disease and either overweight or obesity. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to limit the focus to the weight loss indication. I'm not going to focus on the cardiovascular risk reduction indication because that's a whole separate discussion, and I think it would add too much length to this episode. So immediately after the orforglipron press release came out, another press release, a counter press release from Novo Nordisk was issued, which said that basically the Wegovy pill demonstrated greater weight loss than orforglipron and at lower odds of stopping medication due to side effects in a new indirect comparison that they said they were going to present at the Obesity Medicine Association 2026 meeting. They highlighted that oral semaglutide 25 milligrams demonstrated significantly greater mean weight loss than orforglipron 36 milligrams in a population-adjusted indirect treatment comparison using data from the OASIS 4 and ATTAIN 1 clinical trials. And they said that treatment with orforglipron 36 milligrams was associated with approximately 14 times higher the odds of stopping medication due to gastrointestinal adverse events versus oral semaglutide 25 milligrams in the indirect treatment comparison. They also stated that in a separate patient preference study, 84% of survey respondents favored the treatment profile similar to oral semaglutide 25 milligrams compared to that similar to orforglipron. So essentially they're saying that the Wegovy pill is better tolerated and more efficacious than orforglipron, essentially saying, you should probably take our medication instead. So let's take a look at the data. I'm very hesitant to look too much into these indirect treatment comparisons. Ultimately, the head-to-head data is the best you can get, but what does it say in the actual clinical studies, and what conclusions can we draw of our own based on the data that has been published? So let's start by taking a look at the efficacy and safety as a weight loss medication in patients without type 2 diabetes. And later on, we'll cover its efficacy in patients with type 2 diabetes, but let's start by focusing on those without type 2 diabetes. So if we take a look at the clinical trials that have been published, there are 3 clinical trials that I think we should focus our attention on. The first is the ATTAIN 1 trial, which is a study of oral orforglipron. And then we have the OASIS 1 and the OASIS 4 trials, which are a study of oral semaglutide. Now, in these studies, it's important to note that all patients had a BMI of at least 30 kilograms per meter squared or 27 to 30 kilograms per meter squared with at least one obesity-related complication. So in general, these people all had obesity or they were overweight with an obesity-related complication. The largest of the studies was the ATTAIN 1 study with 3,127 patients randomized to treatment. In OASIS 1 and OASIS 4, a smaller number of patients were randomized to treatment. 667 were randomized in OASIS 1 and 205 were randomized in OASIS 4. In terms of the length of the study, they differed slightly in the amount of time until the primary endpoint was assessed. The primary endpoint evaluated weight loss and the percentage of people with weight loss, but in this video we're going to focus on the percentage of weight loss rather than the percentage of people who achieved a certain threshold of weight loss. So the primary endpoint for the ATTAIN 1 trial was at 72 weeks. The primary endpoint for OASIS 1 was at 68 weeks, and the primary endpoint for OASIS 4 was at 64 weeks. But the important thing to note is that for all of these trials, the patients were on, for at least 52 weeks, the highest dose, which is in line with the regulatory authorities, which require essentially a full year of treatment on the dose in order to demonstrate efficacy. Now, if we look at the percentage of weight loss that was attained after that period of time, we can see that the greatest weight loss was observed in the OASIS 1 trial. However, significant weight loss was also seen in the ATTAIN 1 trial and in the OASIS 4 trial. Now, the ATTAIN 1 trial, we do see a nice dose-dependent increase in weight loss, whereas in the OASIS 4 trial, we'll have significant weight loss, 13.6%. Percent weight loss with a 25 milligram dose of semaglutide, which is interesting because it uses essentially half the dose of the 50 milligram semaglutide, but achieves almost the same amount of effect. This can be important for various reasons in terms of limiting side effects and also potentially easing the manufacturing burden for Novo Nordisk. If they can achieve more or less the same effect with a much lower dose, there are some incentives in terms of logistics and economics in order to be able to produce the medication at that lower dose as well. So what I've shown you in this slide is the weight loss when taken regardless of whether or not they stayed on the medication or use other weight loss therapies. So what I'm showing you here is essentially the real world, more or less, usage of the medication. Even though it was in a clinical trial, this data reflects the fact that not everyone perfectly sticks to their medication. Some people stop taking it. Some people take other medications in order to improve their outcomes. So this is kind of the messy real life sort of results we might expect. On the other hand, on this slide, what I'm going to show you is the hypothetical weight loss as if participants perfectly adhered to the treatment and did not use other anti-obesity medications. So when you look at the press releases and the type of data that the pharmaceutical companies are typically advertising, they'll usually pick the data from this hypothetical weight loss, which makes their data look the best in terms of you see the greatest amount of weight loss. But these are really under ideal case scenarios and are sort of projections of how efficacious the medication could be if everyone took it sort of exactly as it was intended to be taken. So what we see here is in OASIS 1, if everyone took the medication as intended, you would get 17.4% weight loss. With OASIS 4, you'd get 16.6% weight loss. And in ATTAIN 1, you'd get a maximum of about 12.4% weight loss. Now, I want to be clear, even though the amount of weight loss with semaglutide is much more, at least in this sort of artificial comparison, the amount of weight loss attained with orforglipron is also quite substantial, and it is still a significant improvement on some of the older oral medications that were sort of in that first generation, like Xenical, for example. And so I think regardless of whether you're taking orforglipron or you're taking semaglutide as a patient, you've got to be quite happy with the amount of weight loss that you are able to achieve potentially with these new medications. Now, I wouldn't be able to give you a good story without touching on some of the safety effects. So briefly here, we can see that the percentage of patients with an adverse event was relatively consistent across the ATTAIN 1 and OASIS trials. Overall, you're looking kind of in the 80 to 90% range, with the serious adverse events also in that sort of 5 to 10% range. Discontinuations, again, it varied, but you're looking 5 to 10% roughly. And then the nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, I just picked these ones out because I know gastrointestinal adverse events tend to be a bit of a focus for GLP-1 receptor agonists. It's a known, sort of key component of their side effect profile. And what we can see is overall roughly similar levels of gastrointestinal adverse events, maybe slightly more nausea and vomiting seen with the semaglutide, but overall nothing I would get too excited about in terms of pointing out differences. When we get to the efficacy and safety overview as a weight loss medication in patients with type 2 diabetes, we can see that there are two key trials here that we should focus on. The first one is the ATTAIN 2 trial, which evaluated oral orforglipron, again at different doses there, up to a maximum of 36 milligrams, and then the Pioneer Plus trial up to a maximum of 50 milligrams. Now, there is something that I really need to stress if we're going to talk about these trials, is that the entry criteria for these trials was different. The patients in the ATTAIN 2 and the Pioneer Plus trial did not have the same BMI at enrollment. And shown on screen here, again, I'm showing you the weight loss outcomes, sort of the real world, so to speak, effect of the medication when people, some of them stayed on the medication, some came off the medication, some of them use other weight loss therapies. When we look at that data, we see 9.6% weight loss with the maximum dose of orforglipron in ATTAIN 2, whereas you see about 8.5% weight loss with the maximum dose of semaglutide in Pioneer Plus. Now, again, I want to emphasize we're not starting from the same point here. The patients in ATTAIN 2 had a higher baseline body weight, which means that there's more body weight loss. That could be because they started at a higher baseline body weight than those in the Pioneer Plus trial. If you have more weight to begin with, then you have more potential weight to lose, which means that you might see a bigger difference in weight loss. Moving on here, we can see the percentage of weight loss with oral GLP-1 RAs in people with type 2 diabetes according to the hypothetical weight loss if they took their medication sort of as intended. This is, again, sort of that maximal weight loss effect that I was talking about that you could potentially have if everyone did things sort of the way the clinical trial investigators hoped. So if you look at this hypothetical, they call it an estimand, you get minus 10.5% weight loss with 36 milligrams orforglipron and minus 9.8% weight loss with 50 milligrams semaglutide. So a little bit less than the percentage of weight loss than you would see in the other trials that focused on patients with obesity or overweight plus comorbidities. So it's to be expected, though, because these patients were not starting sort of at that same point of initial weight. So they had less weight to lose, so you see less weight loss effects. Now, if we look at the adverse events in these trials, we can see that they're relatively consistent in terms of the overall adverse event profile in the patients with type 2 diabetes. Again, you're looking at sort of that 80 to 90% range for any adverse events. If you look at the serious adverse events, again, kind of in that 5 to 10% range. Similarly with discontinuations, about in that 5 to 15% range, maybe a little bit more with semaglutide, but it's relatively nominal difference. Then we talk about the nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Again, relatively consistent across the two medications. Nothing jumps out at me there as being hugely different. Potentially slightly higher rates of diarrhea with orforglipron, but nothing too outlandish. Okay, so I hope you have enjoyed this overview of the two medications. If I were to give you my summaries and conclusions for today in terms of which medication do I think is best, right now, if I were the patient and I were choosing which medication I would want, I would probably choose the oral semaglutide tablet. To me, it seems to be the most efficacious, and if I'm looking for an effective weight loss medication and I don't see any major differences in safety, then I'm probably going to take that medication. In terms of the overall market share, I would expect that to follow a similar pattern with the oral semaglutide likely taking the lion's share of this oral sort of tablet space. And yeah, let me know your thoughts. What type of medication would you take if you were in this space and looking for a weight loss medication? Please keep in mind, these are just my thoughts and opinions. I'm not a doctor and I'm not telling you what to do. If you do have weight loss challenges, please go and speak with your medical professionals who can help get you on the right track. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to chatting with you in the next episode. Bye-bye for now.